The following account was found scrawled in blood and spent motor oil on the pages of a 1960 Ford Galaxy Sunliner Interceptor 360 owner's manual. It was found in an abandoned gas station in Center Point, Texas, next to a damaged memory card with a video of a high-speed pursuit. I distinctly remember the pie I had the day my brother died. It's funny how the mind can play tricks on you. I can't tell you what was on the radio or what we talked about during the drive up into the hill country. I know he was wearing his red leather racing jacket, but only because he was always wearing that horrible thing. I'd be hard-pressed to remember what color his shirt was, or even what traffic was like during the 2-hour drive out to the country. But I remember that tall slice of pie in 4K high definition. Evenly spaced peaks of peanut butter-flavored whipped cream with broken orange, yellow, and brown candy sprinkles. It stood atop a thick chocolate cookie crust. It looked like autumn, and it tasted like heaven. "What do you call this?" I asked, licking traces off of the back of my fork. "Sweet comfort pie," the waitress twanged happily. She looked like a friendly sort, her features weathered from years holding a coffee-stained smile all day as she moved from table to table. A yellowed plastic name tag on her chest said Midge, and it suited her just fine. I can't recall what color her hair was, but I do remember that it was going gray. The secret to it is it's a little bit of everything. Reese's Pieces, fresh whipped cream, salty pretzel, Oreo cookie crust, diabetes. My brother Cisco interrupted her helpfully. He had been nursing a coffee for a half an hour, eyes locked on the Highway 27 bridge. Like I said, he was wearing his red racing jacket. Sometimes I remember him wearing a band t-shirt for Chingon or 2 Tons of Steel, but writing it down, this time I seem to recall he had on a wife-beater and dark blue jeans, like some kind of a Chicano James Dean. The waitress laughed at Cisco, giving him a cheerful wink. "Yeah, a little bit of that, too. Gotta take the good with the bad in life, I suppose." There was a long pause. The silence in this little roadside diner dense and uncomfortable. The waitress let out another awkward laugh a few seconds later, hoping it might cut through the tension. It only made it worse as she nervously cast her own eyes toward the bridge. The glance lasted only a few seconds before she quickly turned away and busied herself with fetching the coffee pot. She topped off my cup, the whole while staring down my brother. "Nice car you got there." "Thanks, Midge," he replied, his eyes never wavering as he stared out into the growing twilight, glaring at the bridge as if it owed him money. Midge was obviously just trying to make conversation. His car was a piece of crap. Or at least it looked it. The 2014 Toyota 86 was covered in Bondo, its passenger side door standing out a bright red against the rest of the sun-bleached chassis that was once forest green. The door was obviously salvaged as a replacement from a junkyard, but despite its dubious origin, the door looked like the least abused portion of the vehicle. Midge set the coffee pot back home on its heater with a clatter, shoulders stiff as she found the courage to finally speak her mind. "If I was you, I would get into your car and head back to San Antonio." I sucked whipped cream off my red lacquered thumbnail, laughing at her solemn advice. "You don't like brown people?" I joked, despite knowing full well what her concerns were. "I like them just fine, young lady. Likes them a whole lot better when they ain't getting scraped off the asphalt in the morning." She stretched out the O in whole as if to show just how much better. I rolled my eyes at the warning and pushed the plate of the remains of my sweet comfort pie away. Someone wants a 1-star Yelp review. "You here for the tailgater." Midge had a thick hill country drawl, but I could tell she wasn't asking us. She was making a statement. "Leave him and this town alone, for your own good." I was about to tell her she sounded like the creepy gas station attendant at the beginning of a horror movie, when Cisco set down his coffee and looked over his shoulder at her. "What do you know about him? Is he as good as they say?" My older brother had a tattoo down the length of his right arm that read, "Speed has never killed anyone. Suddenly stopping. That's what gets you." The only part that wasn't covered by his jacket were the 3 periods of the ellipsis that dotted the back of his right hand. That was his shifting hand, you see. He pointed it at Midge, eyes intense as he pressed her. "You obviously got something to say, Mama. What do you know about him?" "I know enough to be out of here before 9 o'clock on Halloween. You should do the same." Plates rattled as she collected my coffee cup and saucer, stacking them on top of the corpse of my pie. She squished it unceremoniously, the cream oozing out beneath the sides of the plate. "Yeah, I'm not interested in some Weta hillbilly ghost stories, Midge. Is he as good as they say?" my brother repeated. He always talked like he was some no-nonsense macho type. Too many 80s action movies when we were younger. "Oh, he's no ghost. People that race him, they're the ghosts. He's something a whole lot worse." My brother didn't say anything, which was a shame because obviously this was the dramatic pause in a story Midge told tourists for years. My attention span was too short to see which one would break first, and I went ahead and asked, "What's that?" "A legend." Cisco snorted and turned back toward the bridge. "I can think of worse things to be." "Try it sometime. Something brings him back every year and he can't never stop. Ain't been beaten in almost 50 years. He would have died in a car wreck back then, but he made a bargain with the devil, they say. On Halloween night, this is his road." "Yeah? Well, I'm a legend too, Mamacita. You ever heard of El Guapo?" He nodded to himself, enjoying the sound of his own hype. "No, sir, I ain't," Midge replied, wiping down the countertop. She was obviously not terribly impressed as she muttered, "Y'all always have cute little nicknames, but they never do make it onto the coroner's report." "So your boy the tailgater crashed. Well, maybe I'm the better driver. I've never had a wreck." "Night's still young, El Guapo," Midge replied, mocking him. My brother snorted, and everything went quiet. The sort of uncomfortable silence shared around the Thanksgiving dinner table when one of the kids quoted something the racist Uncle Tio said. It went on long enough that I had brought out my phone to entertain myself. I was well engrossed in an article about how teeth whiteners caused sterility when Midge startled me by picking up her story again. He raced to impress some pretty young thing, and they ran him off the road. He was a good kid. Should have gone on to heaven for his final reward, but he was just too angry. Now, every Halloween at 10:32 sharp, he shows up in that beast. I could hear palpable disgust in her voice as she struggled for what to call it, her eyes distantly focused on a memory. She came back to herself with a snort and a chuckle before continuing. "And 10:34 on the dot, he'll tear off down the road whether there's anyone to race or not." "I heard all that crap, Mama. Why don't the cops try and stop him?" "Oh, they did. Back in the 80s, we had a new sheriff who ran on a tough law platform. Sheriff Becker tried a few years in a row to stop the tailgater. Would have tried a 5th time, but he was voted out on account of how much his bullcrap cost the county. And all of the fatalities, of course." Midge paused to fumble in her apron absent-mindedly until she found a crumpled pack of Pall Malls. She helped herself to one, lighting it off the stovetop burner. The waitress leaned against the wall next to a no-smoking sign and took in a deep drag. "One year in particular, we lost 7 state and local law enforcement vehicles at a blockade in Center Point. 4 officers dead. Becker shot himself in the early 90s on account of the guilt, or so they say." She stared up into the blue smoke as she exhaled, her eyes damp and red from the recollection. "So, now we just let the tailgater do what he wants. Cuts back on the casualties." Yet again, she left us to stew in an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the neon Coca-Cola sign and the pie cooler humming to each other softly in the background. My brother remained stone-faced, still staring out at the bridge as the sun set and the single street lamp at the intersection flickered to life. I cleared my throat sheepishly before asking. 2 questions, actually. Were you the sweet young thing he was trying to impress? Midge coughed out a laugh that left her face red as she wheezed desperately for air. That was the 60s. How old do you think I am? Sorry, so second question. Can I vape in here? No, Midge replied flatly, dropping her own cigarette into the dish sink with a plop and a hiss. I rolled my eyes at her again and went back to reading my article while Cisco continued his staring contest with the asphalt. I wasn't too invested in the article. After all, it didn't really concern me. I would love whiter teeth, and at the time, I sure wasn't planning on having any kids. 8:45, last chance before the kitchen shuts down, El Guapo. I jolted up off the bar stool, and Cisco downed his now very tepid coffee in a single gulp. Come on, Luce, we got a date with a legend. Thanks for the coffee, Mama. Nice to have known y'all. Hope you have a happy Halloween, she replied, picking through the wad of crumpled bills I had left her. Midge called out to us as we reached the door. Ain't too late to run till you cross the bridge. I snorted and waved, letting the door swing closed behind us. Fast on her feet like only a career waitress could be, Midge was already across the room and locking the door behind us before we'd made it to the car. Cisco crossed himself like he was about to receive communion before he got in the car. It always irritated me because he wasn't really the superstitious or religious type. He just thought it looked cool, which it did, but I didn't want to risk pissing off God right before we went street racing. I flopped into the passenger seat and the leather cushion farted as it deflated under the weight. I was only 110 pounds, but in racing, every unnecessary ounce was a disadvantage, so I had to earn my keep. I went through the ritual of checking the dash cameras to make sure they were up and running. I worked 8 hours a week at my campus library, while Cisco devoted most of his salary to covering everyone else in the family's bills. I would have said he shouldn't still be supporting Mom and Tio, but my tuition was probably what ate the lion's share of his paycheck. The point being, we ruled the streets of San Antonio, but we did it on a shoestring budget. Even legends gotta eat, Cisco would say, and the only thing that kept us afloat in ramen and spare tires was the payout from racing videos. I confirmed camera 1 through 3 were a go before unlocking the glove box to check out the NOS. I was more technically inclined than mechanically, in that I could edit video but couldn't change a tire. Despite that, it had been made extremely clear to me that nitrous oxide was dangerous and rough on the car if it wasn't set up right and used sparingly. I had followed the YouTube tutorial pretty closely, and it had never been a problem yet. It was worth the risk to have an extra 150 horses under the hood. I'd also brought along our standard insurance policy, as I like to call it. Not everyone in San Antonio street racing could be counted on to be friendly and reasonable. Pop's Taurus Judge was a surefire way to persuade good behavior and honorable sportsmanship in the rowdier types. The snub-nosed revolver was designed specifically to accept shotgun shells. I'm not the type to look for trouble, though. I always loaded it with rock salt for the first 2 rounds. Past that, well, if a face full of rock salt didn't warn them, it was their problem. I check everything a 3rd time before my cell phone alarm went off. 10:25. Last chance for romance. Are we doing this? I could feel a tremor in my voice as I asked. It wasn't because Midge had spooked me with her backwoods bullcrap. It was always right there before a race. I wouldn't call myself the responsible sibling necessarily, but I was definitely the more cautious one. Cisco didn't say anything. He never did. instead turning the key to start the car and let the engine warm up. He kissed his fingertips and gave our mascot a solemn pat on the head, the bobblehead pig in a hula skirt that our uncle brought back from his trip to Hawaii squealed electronically and swayed on its spring while a tropical ukulele song played. You might be tempted to think that the hula pig is a superfluous detail I added for flavor, but let me assure you, it's the Chekhov's gun of this sad tale of mine. The setup will pay off, I promise. Cisco put the car into gear and slowly coasted out of the parking lot. I had been concerned that given it was Halloween and this was a local nuisance, that there might be cops watching, or at least maybe a few onlookers. But no. As the genuine country darkness grew around us, the only signs of life at the outskirts of town was the single street lamp and the flickering neon of the roadside diner. It was 10:30 sharp when we could first hear it in the distance. I'm still hard-pressed to describe the noise, but if I was being flippant, I'd say it could have been Peter Frampton with his dick in a blender. It sounded like a wounded animal choking through a throat cancer patient's voice box. Equal parts trauma, primal, and grinding metal. It came into view a minute later, and I could see why Midge had called the car a beast. With the body of a 1960 Ford Galaxy, its hood was roughly cut open to allow for a big block to peek out from the heart of the machine. In the light of the street lamp, I could see it was cobbled together from a big Chevy engine with a Porsche 928's V8 head bolted on. The hybrid engine took up 3/4 of the space under the hood, and it roared like something prehistoric. I spent my formative years in a garage, and I had heard the idle of thousands of vehicles. None had ever sounded like this. It wasn't simply loud. There was something unsettling about the discordant rhythm of its fuel injectors and belts. Most vehicles breathed, the pistons working to a rhythm pieced together from notes of fuel, air, and spark. The exhaust crackled and rattled like someone in their death throes. It came to a halt next to us, sleek indigo body shuddering like a predator, groaning from the sheer effort of standing still. At the starting line, the beast was like a hyperactive child forced to sit still in class, seething with resentment for every second it wasn't in motion. Cisco remained stoic at the wheel, his posture relaxed, but his knuckles tight against the faux leather. As per the usual, he was too focused on the race to come to have any attention left over to spare on any last words, and so I had to be the voice for both of us. What the dick? Are we actually doing this? You can still get out if you want, he replied, his breathing slow and steady. I looked past Cisco to the driver of the Ford Galaxy. The tailgater's windows were filthy, and the cab was filled with smoke, making it hard to see any details clearly in the dark. All I could tell about the driver was that he was steadily puffing away at a cigar, the ember growing bright orange in the darkness each time he inhaled. It's all show, sis. So, are you going to count down, or are you going to get out the car loose? I shot him a withering look before I buckled up and took out my phone. I took in a breath to calm myself and gave him a thumbs up. All gas, no brake, he replied, allowing himself to smile just a little bit before stifling the grin. It was showtime. The flag dropped at 10:34 on the dot. That was what Midge and 2 hours of internet searching had confirmed. I picked up the countdown at 43 seconds till, and Cisco honked the horn to get the tailgater's attention. The winking ember of his cigar seemed to shift in the smoke as his head turned, and my brother offered the driver a firm thumbs down while revving his engine. The hula pig danced from the RPMs, and I confirmed the red LED on the dash cameras were on one last time before starting at 10, 9, 8. It was then that our friend's Galaxy showed us what an engine revving really sounded like as the squeal of hungry pistons straining caused our windows to vibrate. My teeth rattled while I lost a couple seconds before shouting over the din. 5, 4, 3. A breath can seem to last an eternity, my composition and rhetoric teacher once told us. I wasn't smart enough for physics, so the only reason I knew time was malleable was because I watched Interstellar, but my comp professor was talking about something more profound about the human condition and the elasticity of perspective. In that second between 3 and 2, I distinctly remember clicking off the safety on my revolver with a cold certainty that it wasn't going to be necessary. Midge had said that the tailgater wasn't a ghost. In that moment, I prayed she was right and hoped that legends weren't bulletproof. 2, 1. Cisco took off, our Toyota gaining a few meters lead before immediately losing it to the Ford Galaxy. The beast accelerated like an electric car, suddenly hitting 65 miles per hour in under 2 seconds. It could have passed us then easily, but instead the tailgater fell in line next to Cisco, matching his speed as they tore down the early straightaway. The fields of rolled hay bales on the outskirts of town gave way quickly to gnarled old cypress trees. The high beams of the vehicles and the dull amber glow of the tailgater's engine block were the only light on the moonless stretch of asphalt. I could see Cisco gnawing on his lip, irritated with himself that he had already given up the lead. The beast was obviously a more powerful vehicle, but I reasoned that was the case a lot of the time when we raced. Cisco was just going to have to outdrive him. "Give me 10 seconds, my brother barked, and I opened up the nitrous. Our Toyota 45 jerked forward like a dog that had broken free of its leash, pulling ahead smoothly as we came up to the end of the straightaway. I had Google mapped it, and from here on the road became a whole lot more treacherous. Hitting the sharp hill country turns at 110, Cisco steered into the curve while his back tires struggled to maintain their grip. He wrestled against inertia as the car fishtailed, only managing to get it back under control just in time for the next bend in the road. I peered down into the side view mirror, and a chill crept up my spine as I saw why they called him the tailgater. I admitted before I wasn't an expert when it came to physics, but when it came to how cars handled, I knew more than enough to know that what the Ford Galaxy behind us was doing was impossible. It had a heavy old-school 60s steel frame, and with its big block engine, it had to weigh at least 3 times our Toyota 45, maybe more. But it was not only keeping pace, but literally shadowing the radius of our turns. It just wasn't possible. He flashed his high beams off and on again, as if winking at us. I had no doubt in my mind he was just toying with us. We were coming up to another straight portion of the road ahead, and he had already begun surging forward, trying to pull alongside us on Cisco's side. My brother dropped speed suddenly, swooping into the tailgater's lane, forcing him to slam on the brake pedal as Cisco blocked him. Brake-checking someone at 120 miles per hour was pretty crazy. It was so much so the move managed to take even the tailgater by surprise. He swerved back and forth, frantically trying to find a clear line past us. My brother was a legend in his own right, after all. I think we both knew at that point that if the tailgater got out from in back of us, it was the end. A traffic sign appeared from the pitch black, visible on a curve for only a second, before vanishing almost before I had a chance to read it. Center Point, Texas, 7 miles. That was the finish line. Cisco just had to keep him back there another 7 miles, and we won. Cool as a cucumber, my brother wasn't nearly in as bad of shape as I was, but I could see where he had chewed so deeply into his lip that it was bleeding. 5 miles out, the tailgater got tired of pussyfooting around, taking advantage of a wide right turn to pull forward on the passenger side. My side. Cisco tried to cut him off, but he refused to slow down. The beast's nose collided with us, the solid steel frame of the vintage muscle car crumpling our aluminum spoiler like a paper cup. The bolt holding it on sheared off under the force of the love tap, ripping free of the chassis. Our spoiler hit the asphalt, twisting behind us in a shower of sparks while the tailgater's car pulled up next to us. I was absolutely frozen with terror. Was, in the past tense. But when that shit sipper messed up our car and tore off our spoiler, I felt a white-hot coal of rage in the pit of my gut. I've been told I have an anger management problem. I rolled down the window with my free hand, letting in the wind. Tailgater was still pacing us, his beast leisurely matching us while its driver continued to puff away at his cigar, the bright orange ember glowing and fading on the other side of the filthy driver's side window. I pulled back the hammer of my revolver and took aim. It was an easy shot, his window only a few feet away. In Houston, I heard about a group of carjackers that would do what I was attempting. They would blow out a car window with rock salt, then pull over and pretend to be there to aid the motorist. Honestly, I just wanted to spook him and maybe screw up his car a little since he'd cost us a new spoiler. Thinking that I could scare him seems almost funny now in retrospect. I pulled the trigger and his window shattered in big, jagged chunks. Smoke billowed out from the cab of the Galaxy, but the driver didn't flinch, nor did the car swerve, even an inch. My first thought when I got a clear look at him was regret. I'd forgotten that they didn't use pressure-treated safety glass back in the 60s. I could see big shards of window sticking out of the right side of his face like glass quills as he turned to look at me. Only look wasn't the right word for it, because the driver next to us had no eyes in his sockets. I'll never forget the way the tailgater smiled at me, his skin charred black and features melted like candle wax from an intense heat. Even in the dark, I could tell he was smiling, though, an intense orange hot light smoldering up from inside his chest with each breath. It illuminated the gaps in his heat-blackened teeth like a skeleton's grin. The flickering ember wasn't from a cigar. It was from his breath, air combusting in his lungs each time they rose, before he belched out a hot sigh of black exhaust. His breath was too hot for his own tissue, the effort of smiling causing his cheekbones to peek through as they burst past the crispy, brittle flesh. The tailgater's eyes had long since been boiled out of his face, but I knew somehow that he saw me. A tongue that looked like a strip of burnt black tire rubber ran across the top of his teeth lewdly. I responded by pulling the trigger again. Rock salt might take out a window or slow down an intruder, but it didn't seem to faze the driver, who already had a fistful of glass explode into his face. "What the I could hear my brother shout at me. He hadn't dared to take his eyes off the road, so he hadn't actually seen what we were up against. He was probably just cursing at me for blowing out the guy's window. I ignored him and took aim at the beast's tire. I didn't know what horrible backwoods voodoo bullshit kept that car going, but a 410 shell blew out its tire the same as any other vehicle. The tailgater had the smile wiped off of his face as the blowout caused his car to veer into us. There was a sick crunch of steel as he brushed up against the side of our car, so close I could smell him, like burnt motor oil and barbecued pork. Then he slowed down, sparks showering from the right driver's side wheel as metal cut through past the tire tread onto naked road. Cisco risked a glance at the rear view mirror as we left the beast behind, before yelling, "Are you crazy, Luce? We could have beat him fair." "Fair? He took out our spoiler, Cisco, and he was breathing fire." "I could have beat him," he repeated almost sullenly, his lips thin with anger. Did you not see his face? He didn't have any eyes, and you're worried about the race? Idiota! I was fuming at the whole situation, my hands still trembling from adrenaline and fright. Up ahead was a cheerfully lit sign of a happy family on a Sunday drive through the hill country. It was faded from years of sun bleaching, but not so much that I couldn't read, "Welcome to Center Point. Gas, snacks, and restrooms just 1 mile ahead." It was my turn to quietly pout as I opened the chamber of my judge and took out the spent shells. I had only managed to get my hands to stop shaking long enough to load a single fresh shell when I saw the lights coming up fast from my side of the car. There wasn't any time to even warn Cisco before the beast T-boned us, going almost 70. The force of the collision almost flipped over our Toyota. Predictably, my airbag only deployed a few seconds after we skidded to a halt off the road. I don't know how long I was out for, my vision focusing on the slowly deflating airbag in front of me. The fabric was covered in red from a gash it opened in my forehead, and I could taste more blood in my mouth. I staggered out of the car, my brain still fuzzy and dull from the impact. I sobered up quickly at the sight of my brother being dragged behind the tailgater. The driver was gaunt and tall, tarnished silver spurs tinkling merrily on his boots with each slow step. He was dressed as if he'd shopped off the rack of the Goodwill, the tattered jeans distinctly from the 80s, while his shirt had the made-in-a-lab sheen of synthetic fabric. The neoprene was tight on his frame, the heat of his chest causing it to blister and melt onto his skin. As thin as he was, the tailgater hardly seemed to notice the weight of my brother's body as he dragged him. I stumbled toward them as quickly as I could muster, trying to walk off a concussion. The small revolver was impossibly heavy in my hand, and I wasn't sure I'd manage to lift it when the time came. The tailgater stopped a few paces short of his car, silently expectant of something. My bladder felt suddenly full as the hood of his Galaxy cracked open along a jagged line. The engine pulsed with white-hot light as it split open like an animal's maw. Something shifted inside the machine, its massive head lifting up from the heart of the vehicle. The hellfire burned so brightly, it took a moment for my eyes to adjust enough to realize it was a horse, or at least part of one. The torso of the beast had been placed in the engine housing, its leg bones an intricate but primitive clockwork of ivory teeth carved to match the rusted iron of the drivetrain via mismatched gears, all fastened together savagely through its dense musculature with dull wrought iron bolts. The thing's eyes glowed with the same bright light as the headlights as they opened to glare down at its driver. The air shimmered from the heat of its breath as it whinnied like metal scraping furrows into stone. It shined so brightly, the driver and my brother were silhouettes against the light of its gaze as I redoubled my efforts to catch up to them. I could see the horse's teeth were filed to wicked points as its lips parted hungrily, spittle evaporating as it screamed again at its driver. The tailgater responded by lifting my brother off the ground like a rag doll. I had already pulled back the hammer by the time I finally reached them. I didn't trust my blurred vision or shaking hand, so I jammed the tip of the barrel right into the back of the tailgater's shoulder blade. I fired the pistol point blank, and with a muffled crack, the shell obliterated his shoulder in a spray of blood and bone shards. My brother collapsed to the ground with the monstrous driver's hand still attached to his jacket collar. The tailgater turned toward me slowly, as if he was only vaguely aware that I had just blown his arm off. I tried to fire again, but the next chamber was empty. He swatted the pistol out of my hand before I could try my luck with the next round. This close to him, the stink of cooked meat and gasoline was overpowering. In the light now, I could see an old and heavy pair of jumper cables attached to his chest. With the sun-dried rubber cord cracked around exposed copper, its tarnished brass teeth were embedded deep into his flesh, one of them clamped onto the exposed bone of his rib cage, the other buried deeper inside his torso. The cable uncoiled looked like it ran at least 50 feet. It blended into the dirt and disappeared, but I could guess what the other side was connected to. The tailgater reached out for me with his good arm, his melted face twisted in a crooked leer again. His voice buzzed mechanically like the rough purr of a drive belt, raspy and inhuman. "Where are you going, sweetness? I have plans for you." Still dizzy, I stumbled backward to escape and landed hard on my ass. Horrified at the thought of whatever plans he had in store for me, I didn't waste time trying to get to my feet, crab-walking frantically away from the driver. By that time, my brother had shakily pulled himself up to his feet and lunged, shoulder first, into the tailgater. It knocked the wind out of him, a gasp of smoke passing between clenched black teeth before he turned his empty eye sockets toward my brother. He took a firm hold of Cisco's wrist, pulling him off his feet and onto his knees as if my brother were just a child. The tailgater held fast to his wrist and placed a boot against the back of Cisco's red leather jacket. The old silver spurs dug into his shoulder while the beast neighed hungrily in the background. The driver kept the sole of his boot firm against Cisco while he pulled back his wrist slowly. I'd never heard my brother make a sound like that before, his voice high-pitched and scared as his arm popped out of the socket audibly with a nauseating crunch. The tailgater twisted the arm back and forth, like Uncle Tio trying to pull the drumstick off of the family turkey without using a knife. It made the same noise the turkey carcass did, skin tearing wetly as the monster worked the limb back and forth to free it from my brother's shoulder. Cisco's shifting arm came loose with a crisp snap as his tendons gave way under stress. Cisco's head flopped limply on his shoulders as he went unconscious from the pain. The driver shook the arm, struggling to remove it from the wrong end of the coat sleeve. Cisco was dead weight on the end of it, moaning weakly as he was shaken back and forth. Once he'd navigated the gory nub of my brother's shoulder free, the navigator roughly slapped it against his own mangled shoulder socket. I couldn't see, but I could hear and smell the skin as it knit together. Plumes of acrid smoke rose from the seam of his arm as the skin melted together. I could see the 3 dots of my brother's tattoo on the back of his hand as he flexed his fingers experimentally, testing his new hand out. Apparently satisfied, he reached down toward Cisco's collar and lifted his unconscious body off of the ground. The tailgater shook Cisco unceremoniously until he spilled out of his jacket and hit the ground again. Blood was still pulsing from his shoulder wound, the ground dark and sticky as his life poured out. The driver was too busy putting on his coat to notice or care that my brother was on his last breaths. It was only as the beast squealed angrily at him that the tailgater reached down to pick my brother up to keep him from drowning in his own blood. Flopping weakly in the driver's grip, I could see Cisco's eyes were open and fixed on me. He mouthed the words softly, "All gas," a moment before I realized he had picked up my pistol off the ground. "No break," I whispered, as he lifted the barrel level with one of the driver's empty eye holes and fired. The tailgater's head literally detonated, whatever combustive gases he breathed exploding as the buckshot ripped through his skull. With only his lower jaw still attached, flames belched out a foot from his exposed gullet like a beacon. I took advantage of the moment to scramble toward the car on all fours. I didn't have to worry, as it seemed that monster was less concerned with having lost its head than when it had had its arm blown off. Can't drive without a shifting hand, after all. The beast screamed for its meal, entirely fed up with the distractions. I had to use my brother's seatbelt as a rope ladder to steady myself as I weakly tugged my way up into the driver's seat. The keys were in the ignition, and as I reached for them, I tried not to look up as the tailgater ripped off my brother's other arm. He fed it to the beast, its powerful jaws powdering bone and tearing meat with little effort. It ate through bone and tissue like a wood chipper, the thing was so ravenous. It only turned its eyes on me when I tried to get the car started, the engine cranking loudly as it tried to start. The beast neighed at the tailgater, who turned to stare at me over his shoulder. When I managed to get the engine to finally turn over, the jumper cables grew taut on the chest of the tailgater. He was almost comically yanked off of his feet as the beast reeled him back into the car like a dog on a retractable leash. The thing inside the engine bowed its head as the hood started to close. I took that as my cue to step on the gas. The Toyota's engine protested at the rough treatment with a snarl, wheels kicking up gravel as I floored the pedal. It was just 1 mile until the end of the course, but I sure as hell wasn't the racer my brother was. I could already see the bright lights of the beast in my rearview mirror as it pulled off the dirt of the shoulder and began pursuit. I could also make out the finish line, Center Point's single traffic light up ahead. It was close, but it wasn't close enough, though. Tailgater ate up the meters between us like I was in park. I was already in 5th gear and slowly climbing past 180 miles per hour for all the good it did me. I could hear the furious thing inside the Ford Galaxy braying for my blood, the beast growing closer. With few options, I turned on the nitrous full blast. My shoulder screamed as the seatbelt bit into it painfully, the car bucking under me from the sudden surge of horsepower. The wheel shuddered in my grip like it was alive, something in my brother's Toyota yowling like a cat left in a dryer. But I could see it wasn't going to be enough. The tailgater was still nipping at my heels, only a couple meters behind. Any hope I had drained out of me when I heard a dull clunk, followed by a cannon roar as my engine blew a piston. The Toyota was dead, coasting on momentum alone. I could see the speedometer already dropping, my heart sinking along with the needle as the car slowed. The tailgater moved into the right lane to pass, smoke billowing out of his broken window. The whole inside cabin of the Galaxy was ablaze from the heat that was venting from his headless body. As he slowed down to gloat, I could see his charred black tongue waggling at me from atop his lower jaw. Even without most of his head, I could feel him leering at me. And I felt my fear melt away in the face of white-hot fury. I could have handled it better, but like I said before, I'm told I have an anger management problem. The bastard had managed to destroy my whole world in just 25 miles of highway. There was no way I was going to let this headless asshole mock me while he did it. I jerked the wheel hard to the left, tires squealing as I slammed on the brakes. The Toyota turned sharply in front of the tailgater. He was still moving at a brisk 150 miles per hour, so when I cut him off, and as fast as the beast was, it didn't seem particularly good at braking. All gas, no brake. It slammed into the red passenger door for the second time tonight, the side panel crumpling this time under the hit. Safety glass rained into my hair as the windshield shattered from the crash. The Toyota 86 closed like a fist around the front of the beast, its impact-twisted body clinging tightly. Thick black streaks of rubber marked the passage of the Toyota as it was pushed sideways over the gravel. The tangled cars came to a shuddering stop just past the traffic light. I had won. I celebrated by kicking open the door so I could heave my guts up onto the road. Relief at winning was no cure for motion sickness, and I tasted my sweet comfort pie and coffee again. I was wiping vomit and tears I didn't know I had been shedding onto my sleeve when I heard the tailgater cut off his engine. With my pistol a mile behind us, I reached for the Toyota's factory-issued tire iron before getting out of the car. My legs were unsteady, the road swaying beneath my feet like the deck of a ship. That was probably just the concussion talking, though. I kept my distance as the tailgater slowly opened his door. He spilled out of the car and onto the road, spasming in the grip of a seizure. The jumper cables came loose from his chest with a sticky tearing noise, and immediately the fire that burned in his lungs grew cold. The driver crawled away from the beast, shoulders heaving as he took in the night air on his own for the first time in decades. His fire had all but gone out, blackened teeth and lower jawbone smoldering dull orange beneath ash. I held the iron like a baseball bat, eager to take advantage of his weakness, but cautious after all of the horrific shit I'd just been through. I was worrying for nothing, though. The race was won and the curse was broken. What followed is hard to describe with words alone. There was a light. I couldn't actually see it at first, the source and the individual rays of light invisible, except where they touched the driver. The charred skin came away in thin strips, evaporating like spores into the warm air. It pieced his head back together, thin lines of bone and muscle piling one on top of the other like a 3D printer tracing the contour of his soul. The process sped up as I began to hazily make out the source of the healing light. Seeing and understanding were two different things, however. It was warm and safe and fit inside a hole I had in my heart that I never even knew I had. I could see shapes on the other side, beckoning to the driver reassuringly. He lifted his head and stared meekly up at the pool of heavenly light. It was the first good look I'd gotten at him, and I realized underneath the burns and soot he was still just a boy, scarcely 19 years old. His greasy hair fell in front of his eyes as he wept at the sight of one of the figures. I filled in the blanks from the story Midge the waitress told us enough to figure out that this must be the pretty young lady. I just stood there dumbfounded, watching a boy find redemption for his sins on a lonely Texas highway, so dazzled by the hosts of heaven and the warm bliss of salvation, my story could have ended just like that. Except for that goddamned hula pig. I told you we'd get back to that. My focus on the touching moment was broken by the sound of the dashboard pig squealing and playing the ukulele. I looked back at the wreckage and saw Cisco was sitting in the passenger seat of the beast. He reached out again with his good hand and slapped the hula pig. How it had moved from our dash to the smoking cabin of the Ford Galaxy was a mystery, but tonight was full of mysteries. I shuffled closer, dropping the tire iron as I felt tears welling up again. "Hey, Mama, I haven't seen you cry in years." "Cisco," I choked, knowing full well that it wasn't only my brother inside the car. He had the malformed eyes of a goat, tinged with a sickly amber, but he definitely had my brother's smile. "This is how we're going to go out?" he asked, clucking his tongue at me as if he disapproved of something. "What?" That bastard kills me, wrecks the car, and now he goes to heaven? I'm going to hell in the stomach of a goddamn horse monster, and you? Even worse. You'll have to go to the community college. I couldn't help but laugh at that, even though it made me cry more once I stopped. I could handle community college. Probably meet someone there and have a family. I'd miss the feeling of speed, but maybe I could get a fix cutting off other mothers in my SUV, picking up the kids at the school. It doesn't have to be that way. I'd seen enough horror movies to know what the setup for an infernal barter sounds like. I tried my best to sound disinterested, but I was curious and so hollow from the night's horrors. That's what the devil counts on. No? What else can I do? Cisco lit up his charming James Dean grin, running his hand through his hair as he shrugged. You could come with me. We can go anywhere the road takes us. We could be a legend. I wasn't sure if I liked the sound of that or not. My brother was only offering me exactly everything that I wanted. But there was definitely a hook in that bait, like a guy offering you a third drink on the first date. It was the kind of generosity that bred suspicion. I took another glance over my shoulder at the tailgater, still on his knees in front of eternity. He lifted a shaking hand out towards them, and it was then that I made my choice. I could see my brother's tattoo on the back of his hand, and I felt a fire light up in the pit of my gut. In retrospect, I could have handled the situation better. I've been told I have anger management issues. I turned back to my brother, with his perfect smile and creepy new demon eyes, and murmured, "All gas." His smile broadened just a little, and without ceremony, he dropped a pair of jumper cables out of the window, the brass teeth popping with sparks as they touched the passenger door. No brake. The driver had managed to get his feet under himself, lip quivering at the sight of salvation. He ran his hands through his sweat-damp hair, trying to make himself presentable for his loved ones on the other side. It didn't matter to them, though. Petty judgments were a curse of the flesh, and they had moved beyond, focusing on the important things: love, family, forgiveness. Unfortunately, I had not moved beyond petty judgment, and was still standing on the wrong side of forgiveness. I reached out to clamp my fingers around his wrist, holding him back as he tried to walk the 5 steps to freedom. He turned to look at me, fear etching itself onto his face when he saw mine. I could feel the fire in my chest as my heart pistoned, pushing the inferno through my veins. It felt good. The bass of my new voice rattled my bones pleasantly, like a new stereo system set to dangerously high levels. I chuckled deep in my throat, repeating what he'd said to me a mile up the road. "Where are you going, sweetness? I have plans for you." I twisted the arm sharply behind his back, removing it quicker and more mercifully than he had from my brother. Unsurprisingly, he did not seem grateful, shrieking wildly as he fell to the ground. Desperate for the first time in decades, he tried to crawl toward the light. I was having none of that as I placed a boot on his back, increasing the pressure until I felt something in his torso crack. "Oh no, you're not going anywhere, David." David. I have avoided mentioning his name up to this point in the story because I didn't want to humanize him for you. But now I think it's important that you know. Dave Hollecamp was a good kid who loved hot rods and a girl 50 years ago. He was a stupid kid then and now. He made a deal with the devil and thought for a moment that it wasn't going to end badly. Spoiler alert, it does. The shimmer door closed, and its light of salvation began to fade away as my beast roared behind me. Dave sobbed and rested his head against the yellow center stripe, praying for death. I didn't waste my exhaust to reassure him that I was working as fast as I could oblige him. The galaxy opened its hood and parted its lips, feasting on the corpse of my brother's Toyota. Its deep indigo panels straightened, the paint restoring itself over the scraped and dented body while it gorged on my family's past. I tossed my brother's arm in through the shattered driver's side window a few moments before it began to puzzle itself back together. The burnt interior of the cabin was restored to its factory gloss, chrome on the dashboard gleaming brightly as my brother gratefully took back his arm. Dave squirmed as I snatched him off the ground, giving him a violent shake until he tumbled free from my brother's jacket. His face broke the fall, front teeth cracking from the hit. Shock had kept the torture of the arm from troubling him after the initial trauma. Even through the shock, he felt his nose break and his throat fill with snot and blood. Jagged remains of his teeth cut his tongue as he spat bits of porcelain rather than risk swallowing them as he gulped for air. My brother's coat used to fit me like a kid trying on their dad's clothes. Tonight, with the devil's 8 cylinders in my chest, it fit like it was custom-tailored. My strength was still alien to me as I reached down to retrieve the driver, his collarbone crumpling in my hand quite by accident as I yanked him off the ground. He gibbered through a broken and split lip. "Don't feed me to it! Don't feed me to it!" The beast was already finishing its supper on the other car, and I doubted even with its appetites it was still hungry. But of course, he was afraid of being meat for the beast after he'd done the same to Cisco. He couldn't realize that I had something much better in mind. I pulled him up close, my breath hot enough to blister his pale, sweaty skin as I gave him my judgment. "This is your road. I think it's only right you never leave it." I opened the driver's door and took my seat behind the wheel. The cushion was warm and soft, and I felt a rush of adrenaline as I turned the ignition on. My brother, with his arm reattached and his unsettling new eyes, was in the passenger seat. He nodded over at Dave, although I think only I could see him. I liked those boots of his. I gave David a little shake to keep him from passing out from blood loss. "Kick off your boots." Terrified, he tried to comply, twisting in my grip for a few seconds before finally stomping them off. The tarnished silver spurs rattled merrily as they left his feet, and it was only when he was down to his socks that it occurred to him to ask, "Why?" "I want you to feel the road," I replied, shifting into first gear. The beast coasted forward gently. Held fast in my grip outside the open driver's side road, Dave had to walk to keep up. Realization began to dawn in his eyes, and he began gibbering nonsense again. I felt a slight flutter of my better human nature telling me that perhaps I was being too cruel, but I shoved my sense of mercy down deep into the furnace with the memory of the sound my brother had made when he lost his arm. Speaking of which, Dave was coming out of shock, the pain from his overwrought nerve endings creeping back in slowly. When the speedometer hit 5 miles an hour, he was already panting as he tried to keep pace. I kept the speed there until we passed the sign at the outskirts of Center Point where he'd killed my brother. I wanted to make the torture last, but with his heart pumping from the jog, his blood loss was getting the better of him. So I gunned the engine, and his legs flew out from under him as the beast hit 40 in less than a second. He landed on his knees, the torn denim offering him little protection before it was scraped away by the road. He left a gory red streak behind the car as the gravel bit through jeans and flesh all the way to bone. I had thought that hearing him scream would be cathartic, but honestly, as much as I was enjoying myself, I was tired of hearing him squawk as if he was the victim. After 50 years living as the monster, I had hoped maybe now he would be man enough to be worthy of my hate. I leaned out of the cab of the beast, the wind feeling cool and pleasant through my hair as I lowered him face first into the road. He struggled for another 3 miles, but the only sound he made was a satisfying wet gurgle as he was ground down against the rocks. The road was unforgiving, sanding down muscle and bone. He was blind after a half-mile, eye sockets full of tar and gravel. Dave finally went limp after his forehead was worn away enough to expose his gray matter to the blacktop. I knew that he was dead, but I still held him down all the way back to the diner. And well, that's my story. Sure, there were a few loose ends. I broke into the diner and got another piece of that pie, and I circled back through to Center Point to pick up my boots and drop this manual off. There were no police at the crash site, even an hour later. I guess Midge was right about them staying away from the road until daybreak. That's about a half-hour away from now, so I should wrap this up. Midge said the tailgater was a legend, and the dirty little secret about legends is that they do need an audience. What's the point of being a racer with no one to race? It's like being a boogeyman with no one to frighten. And so, this is my part of a much bigger legend, the legend of Center Point. It's another chapter in a story that stretches back centuries, in Sleepy Hollow, during the romance of the 3 kingdoms, and even in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The story of people giving up a bloody chunk of their humanity to overcome their God-given shortcomings with the help of a demon named Horsepower. So seek me out on the dark country asphalt full of dead man's curves come the Halloween night. Come witness my legend. I'm El Guapo's hands on the wheel. I'm Luz Cortez's tenacity and quick temper. I'm Dave Hollicamp putting together a beast in the scrapyard to impress a lady. I'm Ichabod Crane's trembling respect for the unknown. I'm a nameless Hessian's hate and speed on a lonely road. Any lonely road. Come witness my legend. I'm the tailgater. Catch me if you can.